once again, we are broadcasting from Netroots Nation 2016, a gathering of lefties, bloggers, hippies, and activists, and change makers, and just generally interesting people in St. Louis, Missouri. And joining us now is one of the most interesting, I would say, of all of them. Yeah, of course. Rebecca Cokley is the executive director of the National Council on Disability, which is would it be fair, Rebecca? First of all, let's start with this. First of all, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely a pleasure. And would it be fair to describe your organization as it's a federal agency?
We are an independent federal agency, and we're tasked with advising Congress and the White House on all issues facing the 54 million Americans with disabilities.
Great, and you know, I think that we don't talk enough about the issue of disability in this country. It's almost like it's a large but somehow invisible minority in this country. And I guess I wanted to start with, without getting too abstract or philosophical, but I wanted to start out with a question of who is a disabled person. I was telling you yesterday, I think, that a group of people, and it was interesting that I mentioned that I have a hearing loss problem, which developed in my 40s, and you want another constituent, and it was interesting because it brought up my memory of when I first had this problem. The first time I took a plane trip with hearing aids, I looked up accommodations. Did I have to take them off for security and all that? And it took me to the page for the disabled, and my initial reaction was I sensed an internal bias because of, oh, now wait a minute, you know, I didn't say I was disabled. I just have this thing. You know, and but of course it is a disability. And so who is a disabled person?
So the data tells us roughly 1 in 4 Americans are people with disability, or a person with a disability. And when we talk about disability, we mean people that have a health condition that impacts one or more areas of daily life activities. Everything from dressing, transportation, eating, how you learn, how you think, how you speak or communicate.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, there's a record of such an impairment, or somebody would look at someone and assume they have such an impairment. So like somebody that might have a scar across their face, or a really large birthmark, would be regarded as a person with a disability, even if it had no significant impact on their daily life activities.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
And additionally, people that are in recovery for substance abuse are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
So without breaking my own anonymity, I could qualify on more than one?
Most people can.
Yeah, okay. All right. And so do you think that the reaction that I had, do you think that's reflective of a larger kind of perception issue, whether it's of people and their own state, or a kind of stigmatization of the disabled?
Oh, definitely. And I think you're how folks feel about their own sort of coming out process as it relates to disability has a lot to do with were they born with it? Did they acquire it over time?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I did a panel presentation yesterday with Kai Feldblum from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Kai has an anxiety disorder, and she talks about how she didn't come out about it until she was in her 30s. And one of the reasons was, A, it was invisible, so she didn't really have to. She didn't feel like at that point in time she needed accommodations. But at the same time, there's a freedom that comes with that, and also sort of there's I like to say it's almost like putting on your armor in the morning. Just as, you know, we get up in the morning, we come into spaces like this, and folks know their civil rights. I always tell people that knowing that you're a person with a disability and being comfortable in that identity and talking about it results in an extra piece of armor that you put on when you go out into the world.
You know, it's interesting also because it probably helps with, and I don't want this to be like a review of my own medical history, but I had surgery and have to ask airlines for special seating.
Yeah.
But I feel guilty sometimes.
You shouldn't. You have a right to that.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who has that reaction.
Oh
That when I call the airline and say, listen, I need a special, I feel like, well,
honestly,
what makes me so special?
There are times when, if I have to walk a long distance from gate to gate, where I'll request a wheelchair or a cart, and other times I don't. But, I remember the first time starting to do that being like, I was in my 20s. I was like, I'm a very physically active person for a little person. I could do this, but then starting to do the walk and having, feeling myself become flat-footed and being like, why am I doing this? Like, those rights are there for a reason. And people died to have those rights.
Right.
People climbed, literally, people with paralysis and other disabilities climbed up the steps of the United States Capitol to protest for those rights. And using them when you need them, accessing those rights because you're a person with a disability, that's your entitlement. You're entitled to those rights and protections.
Well, I think this is such an important conversation. Again, we're talking with Rebecca Cokley, who is the Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. And for those who are listening on radio rather than watching, you are a little person.
I am a little person, and when I walk up here, you can tell that I'm a little person. What folks can't tell, which I honestly didn't start disclosing until I was in my 20s, is that I also have obsessive compulsive disorder. I used to wash my hands upwards of 200 times a day. And I really think it's important for me to communicate that, because it actually makes a broader connection with folks like you and others who have things, who are at this. It's almost like a stage in the process. I have a thing. Oh, I have a thing. I wash my hands a lot. And when I started disclosing that, a mentor of mine actually communicated me the power in disclosing that, because it is a connecting piece. If I say, I did a speech one time with 200 young people with disabilities, and I talked about it for the first time, and as soon as I exited the stage, I had about 20 young women with disabilities being like, oh my God, I have a mental health disability. I have an anxiety disorder. Oh, I used to I pulled my hair out, is how my OCD manifested itself. And it really was powerful for all of these young women to be able to connect to somebody that understood that experience. And it's relate to.
And it's a liberation from shame.
It is.
Which I think is very important. It makes me think of, there was a psychiatrist named Judith Herman, who she's probably still around, who wrote a book some years ago called Trauma and Recovery. And one of the things she said is the way, and we're not specifically or precisely talking about trauma, but what she was saying was one of the ways that people recover is by owning their own story and sharing it with others.
Oh, definitely. I think there's so much power in that.
So, and when we talk about disability as a concept, I think there's two struggles. This is what I'm getting from our conversation: the internal and then the societal. The idea, the liberation from shame, the owning it, that it's okay. It's part of who you are. It's part of the full spectrum of being human. But the second part of it is teaching us to be accepting of one another and not reducing one another to stereotypes or cliches of whether it's of OCD or being little or having a hearing problem or a drinking problem or whatever it is. These things have, they're also in a way a failure to reflect the full spectrum of who in this case another human being is, right?
Oh, definitely. I think there is, a real challenge and interesting tension between what we call that internalized depression and externalized is ableism. The differential treatment of people with disabilities, whether it be your own internalized ableism in terms of you coming to terms with your disability and owning your disability and feeling comfortable with your disability versus, how society treats you. I mean, I was walking with some friends last night to karaoke and got stopped on the street by a family that was like, I've never met somebody like you. And I was waiting for them to pull out their camera phone, and I was like, oh, dear God, not now, please. But that's the reality of the disability experience.
Yeah. That's a highly visible, sort of intrusion. And for me, by the way, my wife is always telling me to wear my hearing aids because I don't sometimes. And I almost got, the first day that they were doing TSA screening, I almost got arrested because they were still working out their sensitivities. And I got into that machine, which I'd never been in before, and the woman said, raise your hands so that it revolves around. And I didn't hear her, and she went non-compliant. and 2 guys showed up. So it's like you never know.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point. I mean, roughly 50% of the folks that are being killed by law enforcement are people with disabilities, and a real issue of it is called the cult of compliance. David Perry, who's a reporter, talks about it a lot. And what does that mean when you're a person who has a hearing disability, or if you're a person who's blind and you don't see the cops with their lights,
Right.
or you have epilepsy and you have a seizure and the law enforcement officers think you're drunk? You know,
Right.
we see case after case after case, you know, including obviously, you know, women like Natasha McKinnon and Sandra Bland, who are women with mental health disabilities that, you know, were in the middle of an episode and dealing
Right,
with their mental
right.
health and died at the hands of law enforcement because of that.
No, I think it's such a fantastic point. Again, we're talking with Rebecca Cokley, director of the National Council on Disability. And since we're on that issue, let's talk a little bit about the minority community and disabilities. You know, I work a lot in health economics and write a lot about that. And if you look at the figures of disability in minority communities, when you consider the impact of poverty, malnutrition, inadequate health care, and some of the other factors in low-income and minority communities, you find a staggeringly high level of disability, I would say, statistically.
Definitely.
And so to what extent is disability a class problem and a race problem as well as a disability problem?
You know, the thing about disability that's fascinating is it exists across all communities, across all races, across all ethnicities, across all income levels. But issues particularly around African Americans with disabilities and people of color with disabilities are significant. You know, whether you look at even starting with the school to prison pipeline and looking at the story, I think it was a few years ago, where New York Public Schools had suspended 1,000 preschoolers in a year. And we know that, you know, when you start digging into that data, you'll see that a large number of them are African Americans with disabilities, both boys and girls. And it starts there. You know, the actual institutionalized segregation begins at that point. You know, you look at the roles of food deserts. We had a conversation with some colleagues that were looking at doing some funding around criminal justice and disability, and we were talking about looking at all the various issues, looking at lack of public transportation, lack of affordable and accessible housing, you know, but then even looking at folks that live in food deserts. And this person said to me, well, what's a food desert? And I explained it.
Right.
And they said, well...
And by the way, for our listeners, a food desert means a place where you really can't buy adequate and healthy food at an affordable price, right?
Yeah. And this person said to me, well, why don't they move? And I sat there kind of dumbfounded, and a colleague of mine literally put his hand on my arm because I thought I was going to go over the table. And I said, because they're poor.
Right, right.
You know?
That's a Marie Antoinette kind of let them eat cake.
It was totally let them eat cake.
Yeah, which she never said, by the way. But
exactly.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is a real challenge. And I think we have some phenomenal folks on the ground doing work. People like Leroy Moore in Oakland and Talila Lewis in New York, who specifically works on the issues of deaf incarceration. And her organization, HERD, is phenomenal at really looking at the disproportionality in terms of treatment of people of color with all disabilities, but specifically the deaf community, in terms of navigating society and navigating the justice system. And it really, I mean, it starts in preschool, you know. And I think I have to say one of the things that I'm most proud of that we did at the White House was we've convened 2 different summits on the issues tied to African Americans with disabilities, where prior to this administration, I haven't really seen a significant national focus. I've seen local focuses on this issue, but it was a real opportunity for us to bring together policymakers with the folks being directly impacted by the systems that the policy engages with around these issues.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And if you had, we have about a minute left, if you had one thing you wish every American knew about disability, what would it be?
That the disability vote could change the world, but we're still struggling with the fact that 70% of polling places are inaccessible.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, then it's time to make democracy available to disabled people as well, isn't
Democracy is not ADA compliant right now.
That's really interesting, and I didn't know that. So I guess we'll have to leave it there, but Rebecca Cokley, Executive Director of the National Council on Disability, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, RJ. I really enjoyed this.
As did I.